John Allen, your host of We the People. We're on every Thursday evening at 6 p.m. on WLTH Radio, AM 1370. We're also streaming on Facebook and other social media platforms. And the views expressed by the host and callers of this show are not necessarily the view of WLTH management, owners, advertisers, and sponsors. Tonight we have award-winning author Susan Peters on the line. And we're going to have Susan just come on and introduce herself and talk a little bit about her books, and then we're going to do a little Q&A, and we're going to ask Susan about some things relevant to her books and some other topics as well, maybe. So, Miss Peters.
Good evening.
Good evening.
How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. How you doing?
Great. I'm doing well. Better now.
Okay. So we're on live with Northwest Indiana, and tell us a little bit about yourself and your books in any order that you wish.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this opportunity, and I think you're probably one of the smartest guys in Indiana, so that's a shameless plug because you're a member of my family.
Oh, thank you.
But I want to say a little bit about my books because I want to encourage people who maybe have a book in them or they think they have a story and they haven't told it, because I was that person. For years, after I came back from Liberia, I had always wanted to be a writer, and I had done some magazine writing when I was younger. I was always the person who wrote the term papers for my friends. I wrote love letters for my best friend when her husband was in the military, so I was a writer. But I did not believe I could sustain an entire book. And so having my experience of living in Liberia for 11 years, Liberia is in West Africa, for those who may not know. It's on the coast of West Africa. And I lived there from 1979 to the first 8 months of the Liberian Civil War. And when I came back, I had all of these experiences just bursting inside of me. And every time I would go to a gathering and I would say, oh, I lived in Liberia, people would have so many questions. I would look up and I would be basically holding court. People would just be firing questions. And my children were getting older. And I wanted them to remember what we experienced, because once you come back to the United States, you have to be where you are. Like there's a scene in Cooley High where one of the characters tells the other character who was used to being on the block, and he's trying to relate to how it was in Cooley High. And he's like, but you here now, Fred, like you are in prison, so get with this program. So I wanted my children to understand and acculturate in the United States, but I didn't want them to lose the experiences that we had in West Africa. So that led me to write just little episodes when different things happen and save them on my computer. And eventually I placed them in chronological order. And that was the process of starting Sweet Liberia Lessons from the Coal Pot.
Okay.
Which, if I was here, I'd be holding the book up in front of the screen.
I'm going to hold it up for you.
Okay.
There you go. This is a...
All right. There you go. Thank you.
So to purchase this book, how would we go, if someone wanted to buy some of your books, how would we go about doing that?
So I've written 6 books, and I'm like, wow, I've written 6 books. I have to pinch myself. But I have a website, SusanDPeters.com.
Okay.
And my books are available from my website. If you get them from my website, they're personalized. Or you can get them on Amazon or wherever books are sold.
SusanDPeters.com.
SusanDPeters.com.
Okay. All right. Okay, with that being said, what advice would you give someone that believes they have a book in them or they're started on a book with regarding actually getting the physical book done? I know it's a lot of, because of technology, we have a lot of vendors now that's selling the service where you just upload your book or you write your book in the software and they help you with publishing. What would, if it was one thing you could advise someone that's in that situation, what would you say?
To start writing, because people are always, you know, finding me or calling me or meeting me at book signings and saying, I have a book I want to write. What would you advise? And so my first question to them is, how many pages do you have?
Mm.
And they want to see the whole thing manifest. And the first step to writing a book is to write it. And, you know, you don't have to edit it. I started Sweet Liberia by free writing. I'm a morning person. So in order for me to even have time to write, I had 4 kids at home. I would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I would sit sleepy and just remember, close my eyes and just free write. And whatever came out, those 1,000 words, I would save them in a file. So 90% of the time when somebody says they want to write a book, they don't have 100 pages.
I got you.
So that would be the first thing.
Okay, so I got a question for you. Can we do this to introduce these other books? Can we talk a little bit about your character, Joy Summers?
Yes. So Joy Summers evolved out of a first book, which was Broken Doll. And I actually started it as a contemporary fiction, and I didn't like the way the edit came out. And I wanted to create a character, to challenge myself to create a character that could live through multiple books. So there was a TV series on with a female white detective, and I'm like, they don't have any female black detectives on TV. So in my mind, Joy Summers is that person.
Okay.
And so I wrote Broken Doll, and through that process, I learned the mystery genre, because each genre or type of book has its own framework. So I wrote Broken Doll, and then I said, okay, I can do another book. And so The Iron Collar was the second book. Slay the Dragon was the third. And each of them have different, I would say, slightly dark topics. So Broken Doll starts with a deacon, a pillar of the community that is found dead in his study. He's been shot, and then he was flipped over and shot in the face. So that means, like, I want you to see me doing you. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't robbed. There's, you know, a Mont Blanc pen on the floor. He's still got his rings and things on his fingers. So we know that this was not about robbery. And Joyce said to figure out who killed him in this really bad way and why. In The Iron Collar, we start with the detectives who are incidentally having a love affair, being called to South Suburban College, which is in South Holland, Illinois, because a co-ed has been garroted. A garrote is a piece of wire that is tightened around your neck that almost cuts your head off. And so it's, you know, why was this lovely young thing murdered in the chemistry lab? So there's that, and it's got some twists and turns in it. Everybody who read it said, oh, that's that. And then at the end of The Iron Collar, I tease the direction I'm going with Slay the Dragon. And Slay the Dragon starts with them going to a hospital to find to find an 11-year-old girl who's been killed, and she has a pimp stamp on her side. And this was a very difficult book for me to write because it deals with two aspects of exploitation of children. One is just out and out sex trafficking, but the other is more sublime, and it's the one that most parents don't expect. So we let our girls and our boys go to bed with their cell phones. We don't know who they're talking to at night. We just know they're not bothering us. And so what is becomes revealed is one of the primary character's child is being groomed by a predator, and he's busy chasing somebody else and not knowing that the danger is in his own home. And I think this was a secondary message I wanted to give to parents, because we allow our children too much freedom and not enough oversight with their electronic devices.
Okay.
So that's the detective series.
So let me ask you something. So if one of them was, if you had your pick of what would be a screenplay, which book would be a screenplay? Which one would it be?
I think the series is supposed to be a screenplay. Like, what do you mean? Marvel Comics don't have just one Marvel comic.
Oh, okay. So you don't have necessarily a favorite.
Well, I love them all for different reasons. So Broken Dolls was my first, like your first love. The Iron Collar, I was really focused on getting the technique of the details together. And I love, one of my favorite authors is David Baldacci. And he does a lot with the fight scene. And I had never written a fight scene. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to channel my inner Baldacci and have like a spectacular fight scene. Slay the Dragon was the most difficult and the darkest book that I wrote. I wrote it also because I wanted to cover the two topics, but I wanted to cover them in a way, like most people don't want to talk about sex trafficking. They just don't want to hear it.
Right.
They see the people on the street, they know what's happening, they find women dead in garbage cans, and that's those women. And I wanted to write it in such a way that it wasn't so dark that sensitive people wouldn't read it. And I wanted to provide advocacy. So I have a friend who is a PhD who works for Cook County in the sex trafficking department. Her name is Keisha Nab Roberts, or I always get her name wrong, but she gave me a beautiful list to use to help people know where are the advocacy organizations in the nation. Keisha Roberts Tab, PhD. She's a human trafficking professional. And so I wanted to provide that information, because if you see somebody being trafficked, there's ways to help them. And I also did a series of questions for a book club to, like, let's just not see this. Let's talk about it. Let's understand it. Let's advocate it. And in order to write that, you have to take that in your spirit. So it was hard to write. And I actually wrote another book. I wrote The Chef's Choice right after it, because it's a happy, romantic
It's The Chef's Choice.
book. And I needed to clean my palate of I needed to clean my palate from all the darkness and Slay the Dragon.
Okay.
So that's it. I write romance in between detective fiction.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Liberia, right? The pros and cons of living abroad. Short list. What would you say they are?
Well, I would say the pros for me, when I went to Liberia in 1979, I was really tired of the way in which Black people were being treated in the United States. If you go back to that period of time, you know it's when the police in Chicago were called pigs. Um, People in gangs would turn up dead in alleys, and there was a unit that it was rumored that it wasn't the rival gangs that were killing them, it was the unit that um, was killing the gang members and blaming it. I mean, there was a lot of subterfuge. Um, we, I felt like we were going in a circle. And I had always wanted to live in Africa. So my then husband um, became interested in a number of things. We looked at being Black Panthers, we looked at being Muslims, and then we looked at the Hebrew Israelite organization and found that they actually had a, a mission in West Africa. And so that made the difference because a lot of people were talking about going to Africa, but I've always been the type of person, I listen to what people say, but more closely, I watch what they do. So I felt like they had something established in Africa that we could partake in. And so that was the beginning of that journey.
Okay, so just before I go into my next question, I will remind the listeners you can call in at 219-885-1371 if you have any questions for Ms. Peters. So in Africa, what was the governmental structure like in Liberia? Was it a formal president? Did they have a cabinet? And also, which obviously probably did. Did they have Congress and Senate? Or what was the political structure like there in Liberia?
So Liberia was pretty much modeled off of the United States. If you think about how Liberia was founded, Liberia was founded in 1822 by freedmen and freed slaves. So that's people coming out of slavery, or who had bought themselves free, were in Liberia. And what they knew to form was what they had come from. So there were already people in Liberia, the indigenous people, but the people that came from here were transplants. They were colonizers in some way. So there was a president and government ministries and so forth set up pretty much like the United States. The challenge that would rip Liberia apart was that the people who came back to Liberia from the United States had been acculturated in the South. Mm-hmm. These are people who had watched Miss Anne in her pretty bonnet sip mint julep, and who had watched, the men had watched how the men behaved. And when they came to Liberia, they emulated that behavior and, in a way, inserted themselves over the indigenous population and held them back in many ways. So all of that kind of came to a head in 1980 when there was a coup and the government of the Talbot government was overthrown and the government ministers were tied to the stake at the beach and shot. And then that is when Samuel Canyon Doe took over.
Okay, so, but I have this question too. Here in the States, particularly in the region here, right, we had suffered from a lack of civic engagement, right? We had suffered from a lack of, we had a core economy which used to be steel, and then when this became sort of bit like one of the Rust Belt towns, or like some of the other Rust Belt towns, we had a vacuum in education and some other things that was a result of the failing economy. And there in Liberia, what was the economy like during the time you was there? Was it a lot of people struggling? Was it a lot of trade? The government itself was doing well, and how was the people faring?
So Liberia, like most of Africa, is rich in natural resources. The question is who was in control of the resources. So the indigenous people were not in control of the resources, but the what was called the Americo-Liberians, which are the people who came from the United States and people who came from other parts in the Congo and people who came from India and people who came from Lebanon were largely in control of the resources of Liberia. So the gold, the diamonds, the timber, all of that was happening, but the common people were not the recipients of it. So there was an underclass and there was a class above.
So let me have you elaborate on this, Ms. Peters, because I think you'd be able to speak directly to this. So discrimination is possible with people that look similar to one another and can create classism among themselves. Would you say that's a fair statement from what the snapshot of what you saw there?
That is absolutely a fair statement. I think there's something about human beings that is inherent in us that we like to other people different than us. Um, it's I hate to say it, but it's true.
So even just looking alike and genetically being almost identical, it doesn't matter if you have the propensity to be biased and unfair. Would you say that?
Well, so I think there's different divisions of people. So in Liberia, we were so oblivious. We were just really ignorant to the actual underpinnings of the society, which is why even America in foreign wars like Afghanistan and Iran, we don't understand the culture of the people and what holds things together. So when the coup took place in April of 1980, we knew we had been associated with the upper class. We did not know about the multiple linguistic and tribal or ethnic groups that existed. We didn't know that they have beef with each other or connection with each other. It's no different than it is anywhere else. Groups of people together are vying for resources. Everybody is not kumbaya anywhere in the world. So we were not aware that certain tribal or indigenous groups had um, like axes to grind. So when the indigenous people rose up over the Talbot regime or the Americo-Liberians, we were clueless, completely clueless because we didn't understand the culture.
Okay. With that being said, what is one of the lessons you think the people here can learn from what you've seen there in Liberia, here in the States among ourselves?
Well, I would say not to generalize and lump people all in a category. We have a tendency to do that. I mean, I hear people um, saying, things about being a Republican or a Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
I have learned to have an open mind because not all Democrats are good and not all Republicans are bad. The same thing with ethnicity. There are Caucasians who will hold you down and black people who will stomp you down. And so I think you have to make your assessment based on what people do. Again, like I told you, I watch people's behavior as opposed to what they say. So a lot of times we get a lot of lip service, and then when it comes down to looking at the apportionment of goods and resources, then you can see how people really feel.
You and I were talking previously, and I had said to you that in 1979, and I remember, I want to say that Harold Washington. When did Harold Washington become mayor of Chicago, Miss Peters? You remember what year?
I was
You were
actually
gone.
in Liberia.
Right, I think it was
and
81 or 82, but I think it had to be about 81 or earlier. But but I remember crushing the Campbell soup labels or saving the Campbell soup labels, and it was some type of campaign help or movement. We used to do this in grade school or junior high or whatever. But anyway, I remember that the political atmosphere despite being a kid, and I had asked you, do you think someone like Lori Lightfoot could have became mayor in 1979 Chicago? And you want to answer that question on air and then elaborate as to why?
Oh no, absolutely not. I just looked on my computer, and Harold Washington became mayor in 1983, and I remember at the time I was at a dinner in Liberia with Gwendolyn Goldsby Grant, who was an editor at Essence Magazine. There was high-ranking Liberian officials there, and when she found out I was from Liberia, I was from America, she told me, Chicago has a black mayor, Harold Washington. And I sat at the table and wept.
Wow.
So no, that was not something that I would have anticipated. This was a special time in which Lori Lightfoot could be mayor, but in the 1980s, the 1990s, no way.
Okay, and one of the reasons why I bring that up is the station here where we're at happened to be in a very special place in that it's one of the first places in the country, or it's arguably the first, where they elected in a major city an African American mayor, right? And
right.
and this, I bring this up not about race. I want my viewers really and listeners really to understand this. I bring this up to give you an idea, an analogy of progression, right? So here they if I'm not mistaken, they accomplished that here before Chicago did.
Exactly.
Okay, now that's one. Go ahead, go right ahead.
No, I'm just trying to, I remember he was Gordon Hatcher, right?
Exactly. All right, so they accomplished that here before Chicago, right?
Right.
In addition to that, despite all the challenges and problems Chicago had since Washington forward, right? Even the challenges today with the crime and everything, for some reason, Chicago has always been able to maintain some form of economy where they don't just dry up, right? And I know part of it is the population. Some people think, well, it's not a fair comparison. The reason why I'm making this analogy is to say that here is really more people here with boots on the ground where they have more leverage than some of the people that didn't have the leverage and boots on the ground in Chicago. And despite that, we have communities coming back like Bronzeville. They've had communities coming back like Inglewood. And Roseland is making a comeback right now, too, with some of the things going on there. I'm saying that to say that should make it clear that it's very possible here in the region for us to get some things done as well. And we have to make some sacrifices. And the number one sacrifice, in my view, that I think we have to make, that I think happened in Chicago, is political engagement. Because I'm noticing even more African-American women, or more minority, and not even just African-American, whether it's Chewy Garcia or whatever. I'm noticing more minority and diversity in aldermen and city council people in Chicago too. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I think that is true. And the other part of that, which, as a resident of Chicago, I'm a little dismayed by, is we have more elected officials, but I don't think that they really lean into the needs of their constituents.
Exactly.
And I don't know if that's a function of that we don't hold their feet to the fire. I think that's one of the things, and that we don't really have a platform, or like, we want you to accomplish this, and this during your tenure for us, or we won't vote for you.
Okay. Well, it's break time, and we're going to go to a brief break, and we're going to come back with national selling author, award-winning Susan D. Peters. Thanks a lot for listening to We the People. This is John Allen. We'll see you after the break. It has no power.
buys houses for cash. If you own a house
So
and
thank
want
you
to sell
guys
it
for
fast,
tuning in on
at a fair
Facebook. We're
price,
not done
call
yet.
Mr.
We're taking a break right fast.
708-359.
And again, I invite you guys to
8327.
call
He
in
will
at
pay cash and
219
close in as little as
88